Dirty money can also seep into the real estate sector, and the government says that agents, developers and conveyancing lawyers have a duty to keep the property market clean.
Well, two guests are here to tell us more about the sector and how it can plug the gaps and detect money laundering. We've got Gazalle Mok from Rajah and Tann, and Alfaseeh Maricar, Director of Technology at Showsuite, a property portal.
Good evening to both of you, and thank you for coming in. I want to get your take for this first question from both of you. Gazalle, how prepared are your sectors to actually guard against money laundering? What's the status quo right now?
Since April earlier this year, when it was announced that the Developers Anti-Money Laundering and Terrorism Financing Act will be implemented in June 28th of June this year, developers have been ramping up their internal policies to align their practices with the requirements under the Act and the regulations. And since then, they have implemented like compliance officers, streamlined the procedure for customer due diligence checks against anti-money laundering and terrorism financing, and also streamlined processes for filing suspicious transaction reports, which is very important, and to keep track of all the checks that they have done. But this only applies to developers governed under the Housing Developers Act and, of course, the Sale of Commercial Properties Act. With regards to those real estate transactions that are not governed under this Act, there is still the general legislation like the Corruption, Drug Trafficking and Other Serious Crimes Act, where they will just have to file a suspicious transaction report if they know or if they have reasonable grounds to believe that the transaction is tainted with money laundering.
Alfaseeh?
And from my observation, I think agents have been doing this for quite some time. Agencies and agents have been doing this for quite some time, but it has always been a very cursory kind of approach, right? But now that, as Gazalle mentioned, that since the 28th of June, it's legislation. I think then things are ramped up, a little bit more processes involved. So I think this really also differs between the for example, resale market and also new homes market, right? There's a clear difference between that. Resale being a little bit easier, but for new homes being a bit more complex because it involves a lot more parties involved.
All right, let's stay with you, Alfaseeh, for the next question, because you're speaking from the developer's perspective, from the agent's perspective, and you said there is that growing awareness that from the sector, the real estate sector, that there is this thing called money laundering, but still you're a few steps behind perhaps other sectors like the financial sector. So would you agree that there's quite a steep learning curve there?
Sure. I think the financial sector surely has had a lot more of a head start, right, in the processes involved. This is still new to, especially for property developers, with the new legislation. It's always been a practice. I think, as system providers, we've always advised property developers as well to have these checks done. But now with legislation, then the processes are different. There's a lot more prudent steps to be taken, right? And so, yeah, I think definitely there's that additional work involved, right?
Would you call it a scramble?
I think it is more of trying to understand the processes, right? That's what is taking some time. For anything new, I think we always want to be able to process it and take some time of it, yeah.
Gazalle, you have extensive experience in your field as a real estate lawyer, over 20 years as we understand it. You must have seen some gaps in all of that, perhaps in those years, in terms of knowledge, in terms of law, that make the real estate sector a target, perhaps, for money laundering. Can you tell us what some of those gaps might be?
I think the gaps would be the resources being involved, put to, in this regard, for anti-money laundering checks, because developers and property players, they are in the business, they are not law enforcers. So they do their own searches and customer due diligence measures based on what they think is appropriate, and so it's all based on their own internal policies, and there's no fixed rules. So with these regulations coming in, so everything is more streamlined, and there is a fixed procedure as to what documents you need to check, what verification you need to get from your buyers before you sign them on. to buy a property which worth a few $1 million. Yes.
And Alfaseeh, Showsuite, I know, supports developers in conducting anti-money laundering checks, through automation and through digitalization. But clearly, these have not stopped certain players from slipping through. So I'm wondering, what are some other ways that you can bridge the gap? Is it primarily through technology? And if that's the case, it must be very expensive.
So, the good news is some of these things that happened, some of the news that happened was before this legislation came into play, right? So I think with the checks in place right now and with the processes involved, and like what Gazalle mentioned, that things are a lot more streamlined now. There is that workflow, there is a guidance on that, right? With that in place, I think our role has been to be able to implement it easily, right, and not disrupt, so that you don't also disrupt the customer experience, right? Because like I mentioned, it involves a lot of parties, not just the agents, but the home buyers, the property developers, lawyers are involved. So there's a whole process workflow behind that. But I think the what is there that we can help with additional to that is really with trainings, right? And so just having software and technology alone will not help. To have a lot of trainings and education, and that's something that I think will really help to plug the gap.
Well, really appreciate both of you coming, and it is a fairly new topic here, so really educating us at home as well as in the studio. We've been speaking there with Gazalle Mok from Rajah and Tann, and Alfaseeh Maricar from property portal Showsuite.